Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a really fascinating and sometimes pretty volatile journey. We're looking into a spiritual reality that challenges basically 2,000 years of separation, Messianic Judaism.
Okay.
We're wrestling with this really radical claim that you can be 100% Jewish, keeping your full ethnic and cultural heritage, while also being a totally dedicated follower of Yeshua, that's the Hebrew name for Jesus, as the promised Messiah.
Right. And that tension, that's exactly why this group often exists in a kind of spiritual no man's land. So our deep dive today, what we want to do is unpack this really complex identity, look at the varied practices, and crucially, the intense controversy surrounding Messianic Jews. We really want to understand why they were so frequently misunderstood, often marginalized, and sometimes, frankly, actively rejected by both the traditional Jewish world and, the mainstream Christian world, too.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then, because I think for a lot of listeners, the very terms Jew and follower of Christ sound almost mutually exclusive. So who exactly are we defining here?
Yeah, good question. Fundamentally, a Messianic Jew is an ethnically Jewish person who believes that Yeshua is the promised Messiah of Israel. Their identity is really rooted in that ethnic heritage first. And it's also important, I think, to hear the language they use. The term Messianic itself, it just means anointed one in Hebrew. That's actually the exact same underlying concept as Christian, which means a follower of Christ, and Christos is simply the Greek translation of that same term, anointed one. So from the movement's perspective, you see, their faith isn't some kind of conversion to a foreign religion. They see it as the original intended continuation of Judaism itself.
Okay, right. Let's try and unpack the movement's internal structure a bit, because it seems immediately clear it is not monolithic, not at all. It looks like a really wide spectrum. You've got people who are very traditional in some ways, and then others who seem to veer into what sounds like maybe historical fringe groups.
That diversity is absolutely key, Most of what we'd call mainstream Messianic groups, they accept the Tanakh, which non-Jews often call the Old Testament as scripture, and they also affirm the New Testament. They observe traditional Jewish customs, things like keeping the Sabbath, celebrating the traditional holidays like Pesach or Passover, and sometimes adhering to kosher dietary laws.
And the distinction they draw here, which seems really vital, is why they do this, right?
Precisely. That's the core of it. They observe these customs to maintain their Jewish identity and, connect to their heritage, recognizing the covenant God made with Israel. But crucially, they do not see this as a way to earn salvation. Salvation, they affirm, is by grace alone through faith.
But, okay, the spectrum gets pretty interesting when you look towards the edges. You mentioned internal disagreements about the law, the Torah.
Yes. So on one end of that spectrum, you have groups who are sometimes, maybe derisively called Judaizers. They take the position that not only must Jewish believers adhere strictly to the Mosaic law, but that non-Jewish believers, Gentiles, must also adhere to things like circumcision and the whole Mosaic law to actually be saved. Now, this is a very specific theological position, one that the Apostle Paul, wrestled with intensely back in the first century.
And then on the other extreme, you mentioned radicals who sound almost, anti-New Testament.
Absolutely. These radicals argue that all believers, doesn't matter their ethnic origin, should essentially convert entirely to traditional Judaism. And in a pretty dramatic shift, they often reject the inspiration and the authority of the New Testament altogether. They might believe only the Tanakh is genuinely inspired and perfectly transmitted. But again, you have to remember, these groups are really the edges of the bell curve, not the mainstream.
Got it. So if we were to, say, walk into a mainstream Messianic community on a Saturday on Shabbat, what does their worship actually look and feel like? Is it basically a church service with some Hebrew words, or is it really more like a synagogue?
Oh, it definitely looks and feels much more like a synagogue. They meet on the Sabbath, often using traditional Jewish prayer book liturgy, the Siddur, but the atmosphere tends to be, much more dynamic, more upbeat, perhaps, than a typical Orthodox synagogue. You'll often find instrumental music, lots of singing, sometimes communal dance, and they celebrate all the traditional Jewish festivals, the high holidays, the feasts like Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot. But they consciously tend to distance themselves from historical Christian holidays like Christmas or Easter. They generally see those as later Gentile cultural developments, not really part of the original Jewish expression of faith in Messiah.
Okay, this brings us right to that core theological paradox, doesn't it? If they affirm salvation is by grace through faith in Yeshua, how do they justify maintaining all the ritual law? If works don't save you, What role does the Torah, the divine instruction or law, actually play for them?
Yeah, and this is the crucial point of separation and honestly misunderstanding. They view the law primarily as an expression of covenant faithfulness and, importantly, culture. It's not seen as a path to justification or earning salvation. They generally believe the Mosaic covenant, the one given at Sinai, has been, well, superseded or fulfilled by the new covenant, which they often refer to as the law of the Messiah.
Okay, but if the law has been superseded, what does this law of the Messiah practically look like day to day? Is it just like the Ten Commandments or something simpler?
They tend to view it as more of a spiritual internal law, something written on the heart, as the prophet said. But, and this is key, that doesn't just obliterate the importance of the physical rituals for them. Think of it less like a strict legal contract for salvation and maybe more like a cultural heirloom, a sign of identity. So, for example, when they observe Pesach, the Passover Seder, they see it as a kind of shadow or allegory. They connect the literal exodus from Egypt, the historical event, to the eternal spiritual redemption they believe was accomplished by Yeshua. The ritual becomes this way to connect history, their identity as Jews, and their current theological belief all together seamlessly.
Right. I found that really fascinating in the research, how deeply that distinction is drawn. Law as identity versus law as a requirement for grace. But doesn't maintaining the law purely for identity? Doesn't that risk maybe inherently undermining the centrality of grace? How do they navigate that?
That is the perpetual tension they live with, absolutely. And it's a question they frequently get, especially from other Christians. The Messianic answer is usually rooted in the belief that God called Israel, the Jewish people, to be a distinct people forever. So their practice, keeping these traditions, is seen simply as fidelity to that original ongoing calling. It's an affirmation of God's election of Israel, his choosing them, not really an attempt to earn his favor through works.
Okay. Let's talk about their understanding of God himself, particularly the divinity of Yeshua, because this seems to be the single biggest theological wall between Messianic Jews and traditional Judaism.
Oh, absolutely. It's central. Many, probably most, mainstream Messianic Jews accept the divinity of Yeshua and the concept of the Trinity, but they're often extremely sensitive about the terminology used. You'll often hear them refer to the Trinity not as Trinity necessarily, but as the composite unity of God. They use this kind of language to try and, well, square the concept with the absolute central monotheistic tenet of Judaism, arguing that acknowledging the Son and the Holy Spirit doesn't violate the singular essence of God, the Eshad, the One.
That composite unity terminology, it sounds like it's designed specifically to harmonize with the Shema, doesn't it? That core Jewish declaration.
Exactly. The Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That is the bedrock of traditional Judaism. And traditional Judaism generally believes that acknowledging Yeshua as divine irreconcilably breaks this unity. It's seen as polytheism or idolatry. Messianic Jews often respond by pointing to certain, maybe less mainstream Jewish mystical or prophetic texts that predate major rabbinic figures like Maimonides. They argue that the idea that the Messiah might have divine characteristics isn't actually a foreign concept imported from Christianity, but had roots within some strands of Jewish thought itself.
Okay, now let's pivot to the controversy, because this is where all of the historical trauma and, frankly, current politics make life extremely difficult for this movement. Despite affirming Yeshua, they face just immense opposition from the traditional Jewish world. Why is that rejection so severe?
Yeah, the rejection from most mainstream Jewish organizations is, well, it's stark. They often see Messianic Judaism as highly deceptive, basically viewing it as a sneaky conversion tactic, an attempt to lure ethnically Jewish people into Christianity under the, guise of retaining Jewish culture. And the core conflict, as you said, really boils down to the Shema. For a traditional Jew, accepting Yeshua as God is often seen as fundamentally idolatry.
And the emotional context here is just critical, isn't it? We really can't talk about this without acknowledging the 2,000 years of persecution, often horrific violence, perpetrated by people claiming the name of Christ against Jewish communities.
You absolutely can't separate it. It's impossible. There was that poignant sentiment mentioned from a Holocaust survivor. Her immediate, just raw response when a family member became a Messianic Jew was simply, "You're a traitor." She connected that belief directly, viscerally, to the violence perpetrated by the church across history. For her, adopting Yeshua felt like turning to the aggressor's side.
Wow. That just immediately cuts through all the abstract theology, doesn't it? It makes this conflict incredibly raw, tied directly to generational trauma and the memory of the Shoah, the Holocaust.
It really grounds the intellectual debate in profound historical pain. And it helps explain why, even while traditional Jewish communities might readily accept secular or even atheist Jewish individuals as members of the community, the specific theological choice to affirm Yeshua often results in immediate, almost automatic rejection from the religious establishment.
And the irony, of course, is that they also face misunderstanding, sometimes criticism from the Christian world, too. If they affirm the core tenet of the gospel salvation through Yeshua, why do some Christians take issue with their specific practices, like keeping kosher or festivals?
Yeah, it's the flip side of the coin. The criticism from some Gentile Christian groups is exactly the opposite of the Jewish critique. It's why retain the cultural distinctions. They might say, well, if Yeshua broke down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile, why are you keeping kosher? Why celebrate Jewish festivals? They sometimes ask why Messianic Jews seem to be setting up a division when the New Testament speaks so much about unity in the Messiah.
Right. And what's the Messianic viewpoint on that push towards, I guess, assimilation into broader Christian culture?
Well, they tend to view that pressure as a type of cultural imposition, really. They argue that God's covenant with the Jewish people remains distinct and eternal. It hasn't been canceled. So forcing ethnically Jewish believers to assimilate into what is largely a Gentile-dominated Christian culture, which, let's be honest, brings with it its own historical baggage, like Christmas trees, Easter bunnies, specific holiday traditions, that, in their view, is a profound misunderstanding of the gospel itself. They maintain that the gospel actually demands the continuation of ethnic and cultural distinctiveness for the Jewish people within the body of Messiah.
Okay, this tension seems amplified dramatically when we look at the reality of life in Israel itself. For the, estimated 10,000 to 15,000 adherents there, the opposition can get pretty extreme.
Oh, it can be truly virulent, sadly. You see rhetoric cited from some extremist rabbis who actually claim Messianic Jews are worse than the Nazis. Their reasoning, however twisted, is that Nazis destroyed the Jewish body, but Messianic Jews destroy the Jewish spirit or soul. There are even organizations in Israel specifically dedicated to preventing Jews from believing in Yeshua, and they sometimes employ quite aggressive tactics, including harassment.
But the most critical, practical struggle, and maybe the greatest irony of this entire deep dive, seems to involve the Israeli law of return, the Aliyah.
Yes, this is really the sharpest edge of the conflict in many ways. The law of return, as you know, grants the right for Jews around the world to immigrate to Israel to make Aliyah, and it defines Jew broadly, generally including anyone with at least one Jewish grandparent. The law was intentionally designed to be expansive, to ensure a safe harbor for anyone with historical Jewish ties, especially after the Holocaust.
And yet, crucially, it contains a specific theological exclusion.
It does. The law, as interpreted by the courts and the Interior Ministry, explicitly rejects the immigration of Messianic Jews as Jews under the law of return. It classifies their faith essentially as a conversion to Christianity. Therefore, the state deems them no longer Jewish for the specific purpose of immigration under that law. So the Israeli state itself is making a theological assessment about who belongs and who doesn't based on belief in Yeshua.
Let's just linger on that irony for a second, because it is pretty profound. The law permits immigration for individuals who meet the ethnic criteria, having that Jewish grandparent, but who might be atheists, totally secular, or even active practitioners of other non-Jewish faiths, like, say, Buddhism or even Orthodox Christianity if they converted to that.
Exactly. That's the crux of it. The state is often willing to accept a person who is ethnically Jewish but practices a different religion, provided that religion is not belief in Yeshua as the Messiah. But a 100% ethnically Jewish believer in Yeshua, someone who might be a fierce Zionist, loves the modern nation of Israel, wants to serve in the army, they are often barred because the state deems their specific theology to be a conversion out of Judaism. It essentially tells them you cannot be both authentically Jewish and follow your Messiah.
So it really brings us full circle back to where we started. This group insists on the compatibility, the possibility of being 100% Jewish and 100% a follower of Yeshua, but finds itself marginalized, pushed to the edges by both of the major historic faiths it seeks to connect.
That's right. Messianic Judaism challenges the prevailing historical narrative in a really fundamental way. They see themselves as trying to connect directly back to those very first-century Jewish followers of Yeshua, essentially attempting to bypass the 2,000 years of schism, persecution, and theological drift that drove Judaism and Christianity into two separate and often warring camps. Their very existence forces us, I think, to question the historical assumption that the split between the two faiths was either necessary or somehow inevitable.
Yeah. The whole existence of this movement really demands that we re-examine those historical origins of faith, doesn't it? What really stands out to me is just how incredibly complicated the idea of religious identity truly is when you dig into it.
It absolutely shows that culture, ethnicity, and theology rarely align neatly in practice. They're often in tension. So for you, the listener, seeking to understand this complex landscape, Messianic Judaism is maybe the ultimate lesson in nuance, in holding complexity.
And perhaps our final provocative thought for you to consider today is this. If following Yeshua was initially an entirely Jewish concept, if it started exclusively within the framework of first-century Jewish culture, law, and expectation, what fundamental elements of culture, identity, and even theological understanding might have been lost or perhaps misunderstood when faith in the Jewish Messiah became primarily a Gentile-led movement over the centuries?